Those forces in the US, in the Republican Party, possibly also in the administration, which are strongly opposed to the way President Trump is managing this process, who probably believe deep down, yes, this war needs to be brought to an end. Yes, the US shouldn't have to shoulder the responsibility for it anymore, but don't want to see the Russians rewarded for their aggression, the Ukrainians punished in this way, who are already the victims of Russia's aggression, but then being not just abandoned by the Americans, but possibly, if Trump were to have his way, forced into an unequal deal.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are talking to John Lough, the head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategy Centre, a London-based think tank. John spent 7 years with NATO and was the first representative of the alliance to be based in Moscow. John, welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Kate. Great to be with you.
This week, we witnessed a staggering leak, a recording, it seems, of the US Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, seemingly coaching the Kremlin's most senior foreign policy advisor on how to deal with Trump on Ukraine. What was your first reaction to this?
Well, I have to say, I wasn't hugely surprised, to be honest, because we know that Steve Witkoff has, I think, long-standing relations with the Russians through his business dealings as a real estate developer. He's been put, obviously, in this extremely influential position by President Trump as a special envoy for dealing with the Russians. He's met Putin, I believe, 5 times. So I wasn't, to be honest, so surprised to see that he was trying to create space for the deal that he's been cooking up in recent months, and that he wanted to make sure that before President Zelensky visited Washington, that his deal wasn't effectively going to be scuppered by what Zelensky told Trump. So the obvious thing to do was to get Putin to call Trump ahead of time. So, I mean, it really seemed that Steve Witkoff here was working on the Russians' side. And many people would say that is, in fact, exactly what he's been doing throughout and continues to do. But the interesting question is, why was this leaked? I'd love to know who leaked it. Because it does, of course, damage Witkoff personally, and it damages Trump's overall peace effort, which Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, he's been at pains to try to claim that the US is looking here for compromises from both the Ukrainians and the Russians, that it's a balanced process, that the Europeans are involved. And he's obviously doing his best to try to sort of right the ship here, but feeling all along that Trump, with the help of Witkoff and probably others, has something else in mind here, that they want to achieve some sort of deal with Russia, seemingly at any cost. And if it involves throwing Ukraine under a bus, if it involves damaging permanently the US's security relationship with Europe, they're seemingly prepared to do it. At least that's the impression created.
And Steve Witkoff even seems to suggest he accepts the Russian position that it wants the Donbass and maybe, I quote, a land swap somewhere to end the war. But he says, instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully, because I think we're going to get a deal done here. What do you think he's trying to do here exactly? And what does he mean by talking more hopefully?
Well, I wonder if he means that we are going to be able to persuade the Ukrainians that they've got to give up territory, by the way, that they control, which is, of course, one of Putin's requirements at the moment. And the Ukrainians are under a great deal of stress at the moment on the front line, simply because they lack the numbers to match what the Russians can muster every month. Russians are losing still around 30,000 men a month, but able to replace them for now. There are some signs that might be slowing a little bit, but compared to the Ukrainians, they've got definitely vastly superior capacity. At the same time, they are taking huge punishment through the Russian air campaign aimed at their critical infrastructure, in particular the energy infrastructure. And although the Ukrainians are striking back, in some cases really quite effectively, they can't do it at anything like the scale the Russians are doing it. And then thirdly, you've got Zelensky embroiled, not personally, but I think can be held personally responsible for the fact there's been a major corruption scandal in Ukraine. involving officials allegedly taking kickbacks for contracts to harden Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So I think this sort of combination of circumstances has led Steve Witkoff and others around him, probably notably Vice President J.D. Vance, to believe that Ukraine is losing this war fast, and they've got no option but to surrender now or carry on fighting in the certainty that those territories that they currently control and don't want to give up will eventually be taken away from them. So I think that's their starting point here.
And regardless who actually leaked this, who stands to gain from leaking of this conversation?
Well, I suspect it's probably those forces in the US, in the Republican Party, possibly also in the administration, which are strongly opposed to the way President Trump is managing this process, who probably believe deep down, yes, this war needs to be brought to an end. Yes, the US shouldn't have to shoulder the responsibility for it anymore, but don't want to see the Russians rewarded for their aggression, the Ukrainians punished in this way, who are already the victims of Russia's aggression, but then being not just abandoned by the Americans, but possibly, if Trump were to have his way, forced into an unequal deal, which would deliver, I think, some sort of bad peace that would hardly be sustainable, and at the same time, the collateral damage to NATO and the future of the North Atlantic Alliance overall. So I think there's no shortage of people in the Republican Party who are very much opposed to this sort of approach. And we can see that within the administration itself, that there are divisions. We can see increasingly in Congress now that there are people unhappy with the way this is being handled. So I think probably that leak is to the advantage of some of those people who suspected all along that Trump and Witkoff are in fact on the Russian side.
Because when Steve Witkoff in the recording says, I told the president that you and that the Russian Federation has always wanted a peace deal, that is my belief, he said. That is a bad peace then, is it? Is that what you think his understanding of peace is, that it amounts to what the Russian view of it is, which is capitulation for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think from what we can tell, Steve Witkoff has taken hook, line, and sinker the Russian position on the reasons for the war in Ukraine, and what would be a just settlement, from the Russian perspective. In other words, their maximal conditions, so stopping Ukraine joining NATO, removing Zelensky from power, putting limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, forcing Ukraine to adopt legislation that would permit wider use of the Russian language or official use of the Russian language, legalizing the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, all these things that they want, on the wish list. So Witkoff has never questioned any of that. He seems to have been charmed by President Putin. He's probably listened to several lectures from Putin on Ukrainian history, about which, Steve Witkoff, to be fair, it's not his background. It's why should he have deep knowledge of Eastern European affairs, let alone the history? And of course, the history is important for the understanding of the current situation. And equally, he's a man who is clearly a very successful real estate developer, a very wealthy man, but he's not a diplomat. And the idea that non-diplomats can come into these extremely complex situations, dealing with somebody as experienced, as wily, and indeed as clever as Putin, I think, when it comes to manipulating facts and arguing a particular case. I mean, he's on a hiding to nothing, and that's why you end up with a document, in this case that Trump calls a peace plan, that has been clearly drafted in Russian. You can tell that from the just from the English translation of it, and which contains almost all the Russian maximal demands. So that's where you end up, and it's a very disturbing place to be if you're, I think, a Ukrainian and indeed a European, because if Trump and Witkoff and others are going to ram this down Ukrainian throats, then I think we will see something very dramatic happen in Ukraine itself.
But it does look at the moment, though, John, doesn't it, that there have been amendments to this original plan, and that actually when Steve Witkoff goes to Moscow, presumably if it goes ahead, it will be next week, and that perhaps we'll just go round in another circle because Russia is already seems to be positioning itself to sort of reject the deal or pick it apart and object to things.
Yes, Kate, you're right. That's I think the sort of optimistic scenario that the Russians say that this version of the peace plan doesn't correspond to what we believe we had agreed with Trump in Anchorage back in mid-August. And that's effectively what Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said. So the Russians will want to get back to that set of demands, and we'll go another cycle. But there is a risk here that Trump will simply say to the Ukrainians, look, there's no option here. You need to sign up or I'm out of here and you can carry on fighting. And he's pretty much said that already. That I think he used these words that Zelensky can carry on fighting his little heart out. And of course, Trump knows that starved of US financial and military assistance, yes, the Europeans are still buying weapons for Ukraine, but this would be so demoralizing for Ukraine. And I think it really has the potential to destabilize Ukraine politically. If it's put in a situation where Zelensky's told he has to sign up to an agreement where Ukraine abandons territory that it currently controls, he's not going to be able to do that.
At this stage, what's your hunch about what's going to happen next week with this visit to Moscow?
I suspect that Witkoff will come back with his understanding of what Putin has said. We'll relay that to Trump, and it'll probably be about 60% correct. We have a good indication that he understood something very different from what Putin had said when they met before the Anchorage summit. And that's one reason why Anchorage took place, because he felt the Russians were showing flexibility and were ready to compromise. And that wasn't the case at all. So, here's a man who goes into a meeting without his own interpreter, without anybody from the US embassy, and goodness knows how he takes notes where he's just relying on his memory. So, there is a big problem there to begin with. Is he going to understand the message that he's given? But I think what's different this time, perhaps, is that Trump seems to be in an absolutely massive hurry and just determined to get this agreement done. So what is his reaction going to be when Witkoff comes back and says that the Russians are not in agreement with what I took over, and we need to address the following points? And they'll be the very difficult ones. They'll be around the issue of territory, the recognition of those territories if they're occupied by Russia, security guarantees for Ukraine. Again, extraordinarily vague what the US has in mind here. And last but not least, related to that, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. So it's possible it will all fall apart, but equally, it's possible that Trump will say, "Look, I've just had enough of this," and the Ukrainians are the ones standing in the way of a peace deal, backed by the Europeans. So, I'm just going to steamroller them and tell them this is a deal, take it or leave it. Otherwise, I'll just go and do my own deal with the Russians, which is also a possibility.
You say Donald Trump appears to be in a mad rush about this, but at the same time, he had given the deadline of Thanksgiving to actually for Ukraine to agree, or else he was threatening to cut off US intelligence and weapons supply. But we are talking today on Thanksgiving, and that has not happened yet. So perhaps there is some room for a little bit more patience, and perhaps there is a slight window there of opportunity.
I like to think so. And I have to say, I was one of those who felt that after the failure of the Anchorage summit, it seemed that Trump was pivoting another way. Finally, he imposed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, major Russian oil exporters, which seemed to have certainly freaked out the Indians, who've been taking a lot of oil from Russia because they feared secondary sanctions. To a much lesser extent, of course, China. I don't think the Chinese were particularly concerned about what Trump was threatening, because they seem to think they can probably manage him. But suddenly, we came back to another frantic effort to achieve a peace deal. So this was going on all in the background at the same time as Trump was seemingly pivoting away from talks with Russia. So it's quite possible, you may be right, that we get into another cycle where the really difficult issues can't be resolved in this draft peace plan. And Trump tells Marco Rubio, well, you've got to go and sort it out. And, let's see if we can have another go. And it takes another, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks, during which time it's possible that Ukraine's situation on the battlefield, I suspect, will not improve. And it could indeed worsen. The Russians will be creating the impression in Trump's mind that they're on the verge of the big breakthrough. I mean, they've been saying this for many months now. Possible that Putin has also persuaded Trump that the Ukrainians are going to collapse any moment, which, by the way, I don't believe. But there is a school of thought that the Russians were happy for this peace plan to be leaked. And it does seem that Kirill Dmitriev, if you like, the sort of commercial negotiator, he's Witkoff's counterpart, that he was the one who leaked the draft, that they did this, in fact, to try to whip up anxiety in Ukraine and an expectation that the Ukrainians were about to be sold down the river by the US. And I mean, that hasn't, of course, had so far the desired effect. It has made people, of course, extremely anxious, and not just in Kiev, because in European capital as well, nerves are jangling because it's just not clear what the Americans are expecting to get out of this, and whether sort of struggle within the administration might end up with, let's say, I would describe them, the sort of more realistic people like Marco Rubio will be able to restore some balance and say, look, we're actually going to damage long-term US national security interests if we simply abandon Ukraine and force Ukraine into an unequal deal. So there may still be some space, but I think we also have to accept the fact that President Trump at some point needs to get back to domestic issues in the US. Those election results in New York and Virginia showed that we can see that in the opinion polls, he's not doing so well. And there are people in the MAGA movement who's saying to him, why are you spending so much time on foreign affairs? So he may have a limited room for maneuver here. But I do think it's also worth considering for a moment the sort of Putin side of the equation, because it's just easy to think that he can carry on for another 6 months and just roll over the Ukrainians. Well, I'm sure he thinks that, and he would like to do that. But there is also, I think, in Russia, some increasing questioning about the purpose of this war, what it's ultimately going to yield, and the idea, let's say, that the Russians get the whole of Donbass. What on earth are they going to do with it? This territory that had been significantly depopulated, the Russians have destroyed much of it. This is what they call in Russian, as a nice phrase, it's a suitcase without a handle. This is an enormous burden for them.
Because there's also the school of thought that the leaking of this document, this 28-point plan, was also perhaps an attempt to see if the Donbass could be ceded to Russia without them having to fight for it, because the price to fight for it, well, it would just take too long, and it would be impossible for it to do it with any expediency.
Well, possibly. Of course, it's much more convenient if you can use diplomacy as a means to achieve your goals rather than to have to fight. I mean, let's face it. I think Putin and those around him are absolutely indifferent to the loss of human life, and the fact that there may be upwards of 250,000 Russian soldiers killed in this war so far, up to anything like 800,000 to 1 million people severely injured. I don't think they care about that at all. But there is still the economic pressure. But I think in more broadly, both within the elites and in society, the questioning about why are we doing this? What are we getting out of it? How does this actually help us? And is it really ever going to redound to Russia's credit that we entered into this war, and simply by force of arms took away territory from a neighbouring country which we considered previously to be very friendly towards us. So there are huge questions then, quite apart from the fact that the relationship with Europe, let's say at the very least, has been so severely damaged, and that's of course reflected in the fact that Russia's not supplying any pipeline gas to Europe as it did for 50 years. The fact that Russia is now much more dependent on China than it was before the start of the war. Russia would not be fighting this war if it were not for Chinese support and the readiness of China, to, of course, to buy Russian crude oil, to supply it with very important dual-use goods that have kept industry functioning at a certain level. So there are, of course, many, many questions about this. So I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Putin may find himself in a bit of a quandary here, or just nervous about how long it will take, in fact, to, let's say, conquer more of Donbass or to force Ukraine into a surrender, because everything so far suggests this all takes much longer than the Russians would ever have believed. The fact that we're fast approaching what would be in February the fourth anniversary of this war, into a fifth year of this war, that many observers, both in Russia and indeed outside, thought would be accomplished in, if not a matter of days. I don't think anybody seriously believed that, but by a matter of weeks.
Well, they thought it was a coup at first, didn't they?
Well, indeed, this idea that the invading Russian army took with it, parade uniforms to celebrate the victory, with some sort of march past on the main street of Kiev. So even if Ukraine is suffering on multiple fronts at the moment, I suspect that the level of resistance, if they have adequate support from the European partners at least, could lead to this war continuing for a good long period, and much longer than the Kremlin might expect.
With the leaking, though, of this 28-point plan, how do you think President Putin has tried to take advantage of this situation?
He's tried to take advantage of it, I think, by just sort of playing for time, being rather vague about what needs to be adjusted in this agreement, trying to, of course, claim that this is not something that the Russians cooked up, but the basis of the agreement sounds relatively sound. They're prepared to talk about it. So he doesn't want to show that he's in any sort of hurry. He's happy for Trump to be the one in a hurry. But I think all along, it's a sort of menacing gestures towards Ukraine, which is that we're just prepared to carry on. We're here for as long as it takes. And that's not something one hears these days from the European side anymore, for example, that will support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
And he's also trying to frame the Europeans as the warmongers, isn't he?
Yes, of course. And this is not the first time the Russians have tried to tell Trump, the Europeans are the awkward squad here. They're the ones who are getting in the way of your, or indeed our noble peace efforts. And of course, it's a perfect moment for I suppose, to try to deepen the splits that are emerging between European capitals and Washington. In the summer, in June, we were just about able to get through a NATO summit without major ructions, but only by keeping it to a meeting of a few hours rather than a couple of days. So Putin knows full well that there are big tensions between Washington and the European partners, and he wants to exploit them. And he also wants to try to use the US, I believe, to put pressure on the Europeans, for example, not to deploy these frozen assets that are in Europe for the purpose of supporting Ukraine. Because if they are deployed, and there are ways of doing that, of course, it's legally there's still certain problems, but if the Europeans are really determined to do it, they can do it, but they're hesitating. And I think there is a broader reason for that. And as long as the Russians can see that the Americans are not going to support Ukraine financially, and the Europeans and don't have vast resources to fall back on. I mean, just look at the UK as one example. France is probably even in a worse situation in terms of the public finances. Germany a much better one, but collectively, we're going to struggle to keep Ukraine going without access to that financing.
You mentioned the hesitation over the frozen Russian assets. The former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen has said that it's time for Europe to really step up. What do you think NATO's European allies can do to make sure they do have a leading role in these decisions and these negotiations, which affect not only Ukraine, but the rest of Europe's security?
I think they have to stand up. And first of all, there's the power of rhetoric to say to Ukraine and to the Americans and Russians that Europe is going to continue to stand by Ukraine as best it can. It's going to keep weapons flowing. And I think over the last couple of years, the Czech Republic, for example, launched an important initiative to keep artillery ammunition flowing to Ukraine. That needs to be kept going, whether it's by the Czechs or somebody else. Now as a new Czech government, that's probably more difficult, but collectively we can do that. Equally, the determination still to continue buying weaponry from the US to keep Ukraine supplied, and Ukraine needs its air defenses particularly reinforced at the moment because of these horrific Russian attacks on critical infrastructure. And then I think there's the question more broadly about how to keep the Ukrainian state financially supported. And here we have to be very bold about using these Russian frozen assets. And then I think anything that we can do to demonstrate that Ukraine is not going to be a pushover, that it is going to be in a position to resist if it wishes to continue to do so. And I think still a majority of Ukrainians want to do that. If the choice is, simply having to surrender occupied territory and accept, very probably stringent limits on their sovereignty, restrictions of their sovereignty in terms of they're not going to be allowed to join NATO. There are then questions about if they can't do that, then what form does a security guarantee take if no European forces are allowed, for example, on their territory? If that's a result of a deal, then how do they defend themselves? Not least because if we're dealing with a Ukraine with truncated territory, we're probably talking about population level shrinking further, and this would ultimately a country with its population, I don't know, 25 million, something like that, maybe very slightly more. But then maintaining armed forces of the size that Ukraine needs to defend itself without obviously having, let's say, access to European forces entering its territory, then we're talking about, I think, a very major strain on the Ukrainian budget, on resources generally, and that affects the country's ability to develop economically. So a horrible set of questions to deal with here. But I think there's still the Ukraine's best hope has to be the European allies stand behind it. It is possible to engineer some sort of peace deal where the front line is frozen relatively close to where it is right now. And there are security provisions put in place that give Ukrainians the confidence that they will be able to defend themselves because they will have adequate support. And whether that's only support in terms of equipment, training, material, efforts to reconstruct the country in vital areas, Ukrainians have to have the confidence that they can see this through. Now, if they are successful in achieving those outcomes, then Russia will not have been victorious in this war. And I think that will trigger a much broader conversation in Russia about what the purpose of this was. And it might even start to, in its own way, eat away at the legitimacy of Putin's grip on power. Because he needed to start this war, in fact, to bolster his power. And the fact that it might ultimately have proved to be unsuccessful then takes Russia in some ways back to square one. How does he hold on to power in these rapidly changing conditions?
And just finally, John, I mean, he has proven himself time and time again, President Putin, that he is a master of manipulation. Has he ever met his match?
I don't think so. Some of us hope that with President Trump being I may have said this to you before, he's the only only Western leader who's really had, the business experience of dealing with people from backgrounds such as Putin's. I mean, Putin dresses as a politician, but in many ways can be considered to be a gangster or a sort of mafia-style boss. And instinctively, Trump should understand that, and he should be able to deal with it. And if he were able to do so, then I think his interaction with Putin would be very different. But Putin has gained somehow the upper hand here because Trump seems to admire him, to be captivated by him. And it may be something about his power that he admires. It may be something about his determination to unlock lucrative, as he sees it, business deals with Russia. There's some motivation there that Putin has tapped into. And so that doesn't lead me to believe here that he has in any shape or form met his match.
To be continued. John Lough, let's talk again soon. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.